Within your test project, you can create a new load test by simply right-clicking and saying Add New Load Test. This will bring up the new load test wizard shown here. As you go through this wizard, you'll have a number of different options that you can set. One of the first things that you'll encounter is the need to set a name for the scenario, and along with that, you'll also have to consider think time. Now, think time is basically something that simulates the time a user spends on each page within your application. Obviously, your users don't just fly through your application clicking buttons milliseconds after they've loaded the page. And as you record web tests, if you're doing web performance testing as part of your load test, they will record some think time as part of that test. So if you were to have actual users go through the motions of the actual job that they would be doing, then you could consider that think time to be reasonably realistic. Otherwise, when you're recording these tests, be cognizant of the fact that it's keeping track of how much time you're spending between each click, and realize that you might be able to use that as part of your tests. Now, the way this is implemented is simply as a delay after each web request, and you have a number of different options for how you can utilize think time within your load test. For instance, you can specify that you would like for the think time to simply use the recorded think times unchanged. Alternately, you can use something a little more realistic, which is a normal distribution centered on the recorded think times. This happens to be the default, and this will ensure that multiple users, simulated virtual users, won't all end up starting and stopping the tests at the exact same times, because it'll introduce some natural variation in the think times. The third option is to not use think times at all, or to simply set a think time between test iterations as some fixed number of seconds. The next option you need to consider as part of the new load test wizard is the load pattern that you want to use for your test. Your load pattern options basically fall into two categories. You can establish that there should be a constant load of a fixed number of virtual users, or you could have an increasing number of users over time using a step load pattern. If you look at the dialog that you're presented with, for the constant load, you simply set the number of users that you want to simulate. And for the step load, you provide the starting user count and how long each step should last before it is incremented to another higher user count. Then you also specify what the step size should be, which is how many users it will add after each duration. And finally, you can set what the maximum user count should be for this load test. The next option you need to choose within the load test wizard is the test mix model that you want to apply. You can choose to use a percentage breakdown for your tests. The percentage breakdown can be based either on tests independent of virtual users or based on the virtual users, such that a certain number of users will be running each test at any given point in time. The other options available are to use a user pace model. In this model, you will set the number of test runs per hour that each user should run the test, and the sequential model. In this case, you simply have each user cycle through the tests in the order in which they are defined in the scenario. You'll make this decision using the radio button shown here. Next, you'll add some tests to your load test. And then if you've chosen to use the percentage by test or user, you'll need to decide that distribution using this dialog shown here. You can add or remove tests using this dialog, or you can choose to set the distribution by using the slider bars shown here. As you make each choice of the distribution for a given test, the checkbox will be set to lock that distribution in place, so that as you use the slider bar with other tests, it won't affect the distribution that you've set for the test in question. If you chose the user pace option, then you can simply set the tests per user per hour that each test should have, as shown here. And finally, if you use the sequential model, there are no other options to set. You can simply choose the order in which the test should be run, and they will be cycled through sequentially by each virtual user. As you continue through the load test wizard, you'll have the opportunity to choose to simulate different network connection speeds for your virtual users as well as different browsers. This can be important depending on how your application is set up to perform. For network speeds, you can set options such as local area network or dial-up or anything in between. And for browsers, you have a number of different options to choose from as well. You can set the distribution of these network and browser types similar to how you set the distribution for percentage-based tests. Next, you'll be able to choose the counter sets that you want to collect for this load test. I recommend if you're doing this for the first time on your own local machine that you add the computer localhost and check all of the available boxes as shown here. In a few moments, we'll look at how these counters can be used to record different bits of information about your application as the load test is running. Finally, you can choose the run settings for your load test. The load test duration has a run duration which defaults to 10 minutes. You can set that